Let me illustrate this. Jaynes' most outspoken critic is Ned Block, who published a review of Jaynes' Origin of Consciousness in 1981 and repeated the criticism vented there in his later work on consciousness. That was in the mid-90s. According to Block, Jaynes committed an elementary fallacy, namely a large-scale confusion of use and mention, as it is called, of the concept of consciousness. Even if everything Jaynes says about historical events he describes were correct, so Block argued, all he would have shown was that the concept of consciousness arrived late in the second millennium BC. That's mentioning the concept as such. He would not have shown that consciousness itself arrived then. That's using the concept. An elementary philosophical or logical fallacy. According to Block, it is, quote, perfectly obvious that people were conscious long before they had the concept of consciousness. Just like there was gravity long before Newton hit upon the concept. Block later repeated this criticism in terms of a distinction that has later become well known, that I will be using shortly, between functionally different types of consciousness. The two most important kinds to be mentioned here are P consciousness and A consciousness. P stands for phenomenal consciousness. Let's say being aware of things around you, having things, no, let me not explain that, stick to P consciousness. And A consciousness stands for access consciousness. As Block described it, a state is A conscious, access conscious, if, in virtue of one's having the state, a representation of its content is A, inferentially promiscuous, that is to say, freely available as a premise in reasoning. B, it is poised for rational control of action, ready to be used in action. And C, it is poised for rational control of speech, unquote. Okay, that's access consciousness. Armed with these distinctions, Block can now say things like this. Jaynes and Daniel Dennett, who is included in the in the criticism, Jaynes and Dennett allege that consciousness is a cultural construction. Jaynes even gives its invention a date between the events repeated in the Odyssey and the Iliad. They seem to be talking about P consciousness, but if one accepts the notion of P consciousness as distinct from A consciousness, the idea that consciousness was invented by the Greeks is, this is an argument, I'm still quoting, the idea is simply ludicrous. That was the argument. If there is such a thing as P consciousness, surely it is a basic biological feature of us. The same is true of A consciousness. Obviously, our ability to access information from the senses is genetically programmed. The conflation is especially silly in Jaynes, where it is obvious that consciousness in the sense of blah, blah, blah. Oh no, not blah, blah. That's a particularly important point. Where it is obvious that consciousness in the sense in which it is supposed to have been invented by the Greeks is something like a theory of consciousness in roughly the phenomenal sense. There is a lot in this quote, unquote. There is a lot in this quotation that I object to, but I will limit myself here to 1 or 2 points. For more details, I refer you to the printed paper. First of all, I think it is anything but obvious to say that, as I just quoted, consciousness in the sense in which it is supposed to have been invented by the Greeks is something like a theory of consciousness in roughly the phenomenal sense, unquote. That's not what Jaynes is writing about. If you read the book carefully, and even if you read it in a sloppy way, it's all too evident in the pages. The situation is totally different. Although there is a difficulty judging the matter because of Jaynes's rather idiosyncratic use of the concept of consciousness. Okay. But I suggest that what Jaynes was after, what he was primarily interested in, is the emergence of A consciousness in roughly Block's sense of the word. Why is that? Jaynes is speaking about things like mind space, the interior space from the previous talk, and an analog eye, a mind space in which contents are, which acts like a stage for contents to be introspected, and an analog eye that does the introspecting. That's the modern type of mind described by Jaynes. Well, that projects in a perfect way on, that tallies with, the description given of a consciousness by Ned Block. Mind space is a space in which mental contents are explicitly represented for introspection, deliberation, and planning of action by the analog eye. Or in Block's terms, where we find contents poised for use as a premise in reasoning and for rational control of action and speech. That's my first point, simply a correction, if you like. Block doesn't understand what Jaynes is saying. Secondly, my second point about Block is that he really has only intuitions to offer as an argument. From a strictly rational point of view, that's weak, of course. That's a weakness in his way of going about. On the other hand, however, I happen to share these intuitions, as do most people. The intuitions involved are widespread and pretty strong. How to argue against them? The intuitions are argued by the standard fringe mind strategy, as I put it, the Platonic impulse, the ahistoric bias of our normal theorizing about the human mind. What can we do against that? I think there are two things that we can do. First, capitalize on the strong points of the opposite research strategy. Think in terms of not pushing out the normal mind as far back as possible to the fringes, but let the fringes reach in. See how far that gets you. Simply target on a modern, well-received model of the mind, call that the target model, and see how more ancient minds, more primitive minds, minds of other civilizations, could be anything, in which respects they diverge from the standard model, and then check how far the fringe mind we're discussing reaches in or reaches up to the normal model. I'll give an example presently. That's the first thing to do, capitalize on the strong points of the opposite strategy. Secondly, we could try to diffuse or deconstruct the intuitions involved, the intuitions behind, in this case, Block's argument. I have two examples. In my paper I have 4 or 5 examples. 2 examples that I might be discussing here. I'll see how far I can get. I have 2 examples prepared. Let's see how far I can get. Start with the first one. The first has to do with Block's idea that it is simply absurd to suppose that consciousness, that for consciousness to exist, one should need the concept of consciousness in a culture. It's simply absurd to suppose that consciousness is based on a concept. That's what Block claims. At first sight, he seems to be quite right, I would say. He seems to be quite right to reject the claim that consciousness could be a social construction, in the sense that it was based on a concept of consciousness. To cut right through the bone of the argument, I will simply assume here that we are dealing with a consciousness, access consciousness, as defined earlier. That makes a connection with Block, makes the argument perfectly lucid. Now, according to widely accepted standard accounts of what concepts are, we have something like the following. In order to have a concept, you must have inferential promiscuity, the term Block used, in a sufficiently large network of other concepts. You must have a network of concepts in order to have a single concept. And the network of concepts must be such that the concepts are interconnected. There must be logical, inferential, reasoning type relations between the individual concepts. If you want to have a concept, you must have a sufficiently large, logically articulate system of clear and distinct contents. Okay, let's assume that too. Following Block's definition of access consciousness, I think it is rather safe to say that you cannot have access consciousness without concepts. You would have a space in which concepts could be present, but no concepts to be present in it. That would be simply absurd. You need concepts in order to have access consciousness. I think the reverse also holds, reasoning from Block's point of view. Namely, that you cannot have concepts without access consciousness. That would mean Now, after all, what good would concepts be without a virtual working space, to put it like that, in which they could be put to work? Would simply make no sense. But now we have a dilemma. Either cultures were conscious without having the concept of consciousness, or they were unconscious and could not possibly have had any concepts at all. It's not difficult to see. Perhaps you missed the point. Let me put it in slightly different terms. If anything, qualifying as a culture is necessarily based on concepts, and if concepts require access consciousness, then necessarily every culture is conscious. Very simple.